In the arid expanse of 1870s Nevada, the earth bled silver, and men bled for the earth. The silver boom was a fever that had seized the nation, creating a landscape of stark contrasts: opulent mansions for the mine owners, and shallow graves for the workers who fueled their wealth. Every day, the sun would rise over the jagged peaks, illuminating a world of dust, sweat, and the relentless clang of steel against stone. For the common miner, life was a pendulum swinging between the hope of a lucky strike and the certainty of a dangerous descent. They were men who gambled their lives against the mountain's unforgiving geology, burrowing into the planet's bowels for a pittance. The air in these boomtowns was thick with mineral dust and desperation, a volatile mixture where a man's worth was weighed not by his character, but by the heft of the ore he could haul from the suffocating darkness below. It was a brutal, daily sacrament of labor and risk, performed under the indifferent gaze of a vast, empty sky. Among these men was Jedediah "Jed" Stone, a man in his 40s whose face was a roadmap of hardship and whose hands were calloused into permanence. Jed was not a greedy man by nature, but a desperate one, burdened by debts that felt as immense as the mountains themselves, and a family whose hunger was a constant, gnawing presence in his mind. Each morning, he would watch with a quiet, burning envy as carts laden with shimmering, high-grade ore were pulled from the shafts, a fortune he could see and smell but never touch. This envy was a slow-acting poison, corrupting his good nature with the insidious whisper of, what if? He saw the mine not just as a workplace, but as a malevolent gatekeeper, hoarding a treasure that rightfully belonged to those who risked their skin in its depths. His prayers, once for safety, had slowly transformed into pleas for a single life-altering discovery, a single vein that would deliver him from the crushing weight of his existence. The entrance to the main shaft of the Comstock region's newest operation was known simply as the Maw. It was a dark, timber-framed orifice that seemed to inhale the light and exhale a chill, damp breath smelling of wet earth and metallic ozone. For the miners, it was a place of profound cognitive dissonance. Their Protestant faith taught them that the earth's riches were a blessing from God, yet the descent into that absolute blackness felt like a journey into the vestibule of hell itself. Every day, before surrendering himself to the gloom, Jed would tip his worn hat to the heavens, a final, fleeting acknowledgement of the sun. But this ritual was no longer one of pure faith. It had become a gambler's twitch, a superstitious plea to a silent God for favor in the abyss. On one particular morning, with the weight of his debts heavier than ever, he took his carbide lamp, stepped onto the crude lift, and was swallowed by the sepulchral darkness, unaware that the mountain had already marked him. 150 years later, the site is almost unrecognizable. The clamor of industry has been replaced by the whisper of the wind through sagebrush. The mountain, scarred and pitted, has begun the slow process of healing, its slopes now dotted with juniper and hardy grasses. Yet, one feature remains defiantly man-made, a testament to a horror that time has failed to erase. Where the Maw once gaped, there now stands a thick, imposing wall of dark, weathered brick, its mortar bleeding like old scars. Set into the center of this formidable barrier is a heavy iron door, not with a lock, but with massive, rusted bolts hammered shut from the outside. There is no handle, no way to open it, only a crude plaque bearing a name. This is no ordinary mine closure. It is not a gate but a tombstone. It is a structure built not to keep people out, but to keep something in, a permanent and desperate act of quarantine against the deep earth. The place is known today by the name on that corroded plaque, the Misery Lode. To the few locals who remember the old stories, the name is not a reference to the hardship of mining, but a direct consequence of its final, terrible chapter. The official records from the era are suspiciously thin, citing a catastrophic fire damp explosion that made the entire operation unstable and resulted in its permanent closure. But the legend, passed down in hushed tones from one generation of prospectors to the next, tells a different story. It speaks of a mine that did not simply kill men, but consumed them. It tells of how, over the course of a few terrifying weeks, more than a dozen miners vanished without a trace from the deepest tunnels, their disappearances swallowed by a silence more profound than any cave-in. The company's explanation was a convenient fiction, a necessary lie to quell a panic that threatened to shatter the entire region. The folklore that clings to the misery load is primal and chillingly specific. The storytellers claim the mine itself became a living entity, a hungry stomach in the bowels of the earth. The men weren't lost to accidents. They were taken. The accounts become vague on the nature of the threat, attributing it to vengeful spirits of the mountain, or Tommyknockers, the mythical goblins of miner lore finally turning truly malevolent. Yet, the most disturbing part of the legend concerns its sealing. The old-timers don't say it was closed by the company. They say it was sealed by the devil himself, a phrase meant to convey a horror so absolute that only a force of equal malevolence could contain it. The brick and iron are not just a barrier. They are the physical manifestation of a profound, unspeakable fear. What could have been discovered down there that would compel men to entomb their own, to wall off a section of the world with such finality? The legend is an echo that endures to this day, a chilling whisper on the Nevada wind. And since these stories travel through time, weaving themselves into the fabric of the places they haunt, tell us in the comments from which city you join us in this investigation and the exact time of your viewing. Your presence marks a new entry in this grim archive. With that recorded, let us return to the year 1877, to a time before the bricks and iron, and discover how the first fatal crack appeared in the thin veneer of reality, deep beneath the Nevada soil. We will witness the moment when one man's desperation became the key that unlocked a door that should have remained sealed for all eternity. The story of Jedediah Stone is not just a tragedy, it is a beginning. The thin wooden walls of Jedediah Stone's cabin offered little defense against the encroaching chill of the Nevada night, nor could they contain the quiet desperation that had become a permanent resident within. His wife, Capri Mary, sat by the weak light of a tallow candle, her needle weaving in and out of a tattered shirt with a practiced, weary rhythm. The argument they were having was not a storm, but a slow, grinding erosion of hope. It was a conversation they had had 100 times, a litany of debts owed, of the flour sack growing lighter, of their children's worn-out shoes. "It's not enough, Jed," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sighing wind. "The company store takes its share before we even see the coin. We're digging a deeper hole than any you work in." Each word was a precise, painful incision, laying bare the truth that Jed's backbreaking labor was yielding nothing but more exhaustion and deeper anxiety. His dream of a prosperous life had devolved into a grim struggle for mere subsistence. Jedediah looked at his own hands, resting on the rough-hewn table. They were instruments of hard labor, thick with calluses and permanently stained with the grit of the earth, yet they could not provide. He saw them not as tools of a proud working man, but as symbols of his failure. There was no anger in his heart for Mary. Her words were the simple, unvarnished truth, and that is what made them so unbearable. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage built of his own inadequacies. Without a word, he stood, the scrape of his chair against the floorboards, sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the cold night, not to escape his wife, but to escape the suffocating presence of his own helplessness. The weight of his family's future rested squarely on his shoulders, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that the honest path he walked was leading them only to ruin. A change was needed, a gamble. The swing doors of the Gilded Cage Saloon offered a jarring transition from the cold, silent night to a world of manufactured cheer. The air inside was a thick soup of stale cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the sweat of men desperate to forget the darkness they had just left behind. A player piano in the corner hammered out a tinny, slightly out-of-tune melody that barely rose above the din of boisterous laughter and shouted conversations. Here, for the price of a few cents, a man could buy a temporary reprieve from his troubles, drowning them in cheap liquor, in the company of others equally afflicted by the silver fever. Jed found a spot at the crowded bar, the warmth of the room doing little to thaw the cold knot of dread in his stomach. He ordered a whiskey, the amber liquid a poor substitute for the solution he so desperately needed, and let the noise of the saloon wash over him, a chaotic but welcome distraction. It was then that he overheard the voice, a gravelly, whiskey-soaked rasp that cut through the surrounding chatter. It belonged to an old prospector named Hemlock, a man whose face was a testament to a lifetime of sun, dust, and disappointment. He was a fixture in the saloon, known more for his fantastical stories than for any silver he'd ever found. Usually, his tales of monstrous nuggets and ghostly encounters were met with indulgent chuckles, but tonight was different. He was hunched over his glass, speaking to a small, captive audience of younger miners, his eyes wide with a mixture of intoxication and what looked like genuine fear. He wasn't bragging, he was warning. "It ain't natural silver," Hemlock slurred, leaning in conspiratorially. "It glows, they say. Sings to you from inside the rock. But it's a siren song, boys. A tune that leads you straight to hell." The usual bravado was gone, replaced by a tremor of conviction that made the hairs on Jed's neck stand on end. The old man spoke of a specific place, a tunnel in the older, deeper section of the mine, one that had been sealed off for decades after a series of accidents. He called the lode the Ghost Silver Vein, a name that sent a subtle chill through the overheated room. According to the legend, it wasn't ore, but pure, native silver that ran through the rock in thick, branching ribbons, shimmering with a faint, pale light of its own. But the wealth was said to be cursed. Men who had sought it, drawn by its impossible purity, were never the same. Some vanished entirely, while others returned to the surface babbling about whispers in the darkness and moving shadows, their minds shattered. The company had officially condemned the section due to geological instability, but Hemlock claimed the truth was far more sinister. "The mountain don't want that silver touched," he concluded, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "It guards it." The next morning, the hazy memories of the saloon's legend contrasted sharply with the pragmatic reality of the mine, a reality embodied by the foreman, Silas Croft, a grizzled veteran of a dozen mining booms and busts. Silas was a man carved from the same stubborn rock he sent his men to break. Unlike the distant, unseen mine owners who viewed the operation as a set of figures on a ledger, Silas saw it as a collection of lives under his protection. His daily routine began not in an office, but in the tunnels themselves. He moved with a practiced ease through the dark, cramped spaces, his hand running over timber supports, his ear attuned to the subtle groans of the earth. He knew the mine not from a map, but as a living, breathing entity, with moods and dangers that only experience could teach. He felt a paternal, almost fierce responsibility for his crew, a sentiment that made him both respected and, at times, feared. Before the morning shift descended, Silas gathered his crew near the entrance of the maw. His briefings were legendary for their bluntness. "I hear the whispers," he began, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "Talk of lucky strikes in the old shafts, of ghosts and goblins guarding treasure. I don't give a damn about Tommyknockers, but I care about unstable rock and bad air." He pointed a thick, scarred finger towards the darkness of the shaft. "You stick to the marked tunnels. You follow the new timber. There are no shortcuts to silver, only shortcuts to a cheap coffin. We've lost men to greed before. They stray from the path, thinking they're smarter than the mountain. The mountain always proves them wrong. Don't you be the next lesson." His gaze swept across the faces of the miners, lingering for a moment on Jed, whose eyes seemed fixed on some distant point deep within the earth. Silas then became more specific, his tone hardening. "And that goes double for the 700-foot level Ig Western Gallery. It's been sealed since before this company even bought the claim. The survey maps mark it as a dead end with a high risk of fire damp and rockfalls. There is nothing for you down there but a quick and lonely death. The barricades are there for a reason. They are not a challenge. They are a tombstone. Anyone caught tampering with them will be out of a job before they can draw their next breath." "Am I understood?" A chorus of grunts and nods answered him. The foreman's law was absolute in the underworld of the mine, but for Jed, the warning had the opposite effect. It was not a deterrent, but a confirmation. Silas's vehement prohibition of that specific area lent a terrifying credibility to the old prospector's drunken tale. The treasure was real enough to be strictly forbidden. That night, the seed of tragedy, planted in the saloon and watered by the foreman's warning, finally took root. Under the cold, indifferent light of a crescent moon, Jedediah Stone moved like a phantom through the sleeping mining camp. Every crunch of gravel under his boots sounded like a thunderclap in the profound silence. He made his way to the company's storage shed, a small, heavily padlocked structure where the explosives were kept. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. After a tense struggle with the lock, the door creaked open, revealing stacks of wooden crates. The air inside was cool and smelled of chemicals and oily paper. With trembling hands, Jed lifted the lid of a crate and carefully removed 4 sticks of dynamite. They felt dense and waxy in his grasp, strangely inert for objects that held such destructive power. He tucked them inside his coat, the seed of his terrible ambition now a physical weight against his chest. Before returning to the shadows, Jed paused and looked up at the skeletal headframe of the mine, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It no longer looked like his place of work, a source of meager wages and endless toil. In his mind's eye, shaped by desperation and the promise of the ghost silver vein, it had transformed. It was now a vault, a fortress guarding a treasure that could solve all his problems. The foreman's warnings and the old man's legends swirled in his thoughts, but they were drowned out by the cries of his hungry children and the weary face of his wife. He had made his choice. In the silence of the Nevada night, with 4 sticks of dynamite nestled against his heart, Jedediah Stone had set a course from which there would be no return. He was no longer just a miner. He was a tomb raider, and the tomb he was about to violate was far deeper and darker than he could ever imagine. The mine operated on a rhythm of noise and silence. The clamor of pickaxes, carts, and human shouts defined the day shifts, a symphony of industrial conquest. But between these cycles, an entirely different mine existed. It was in this profound, echoing silence that Jedediah Stone made his descent. On a solitary, unauthorized shift, under the pretense of checking on timber supports, he journeyed deeper than he ever had alone. The familiar tunnels took on a menacing quality in the isolation, the darkness pressing in not as a mere absence of light, but as a physical presence. The drip of water from the rock walls was the only sound, a slow, patient ticking clock counting down to a fate already sealed. Every shadow thrown by his carbide lamp seemed to dance with malevolent intent, and the air grew colder, more ancient. With every step he took toward the forbidden 700-foot level, he found the barricade exactly where Silas had described it, a crude wall of rotting timbers and discarded rock, hastily erected decades ago. A faded, barely legible word, "condemned," was scrawled across the main support beam in what looked like tar. The air behind it was stale and dead, holding a stillness that felt fundamentally different from the rest of the mine. A tangible sense of forgotten history and deliberate avoidance clung to the place. For a moment, the foreman's stern warning echoed in Jed's mind. This was a grave marker, not a door, but the image of his wife's weary face was a more potent ghost. With the grim determination of a man who had already accepted his own damnation, he used his pickaxe as a lever, prying the old timbers loose. They splintered with a dry, protesting shriek, opening a passage into a darkness that had not been disturbed by human hands in a generation. Deeper within the sealed gallery, the tunnel floor became uneven, littered with the petrified tools of a bygone era. It was here, at the tunnel's terminus, that he saw it. The rock formation was not what he expected. It was a wall of black, oddly smooth stone that seemed to absorb the light from his lamp rather than reflect it. Running through it were not veins of silver, but strange, almost biological patterns that resembled fused vertebrae or the overlapping plates of some immense carapace. Yet, in the heart of this bizarre geology, a faint, rhythmic pulse of pale light emanated from within the rock, a soft luminescence that seemed to breathe. It was the ghost silver, just as the old prospector had described. Blinded by this confirmation of the legend, Jed saw not a geological anomaly, but the shimmering, solidified answer to all of his prayers, a divine reward for his trespass. He worked with a feverish, almost manic efficiency, his fear completely eclipsed by the promise of imminent wealth. The 4 sticks of dynamite felt like holy relics in his hands. He drilled into the strange rock with his hand steel, the bit making a strangely dull organic sound as it penetrated the surface. There was no hesitation in his movements, only the meticulous precision of a man executing the final, desperate step of a long-conceived plan. He carefully packed the charges into the holes he had made, tamping them down with clay. He measured the fuse with a practiced eye, ensuring he would have just enough time to retreat to a safe distance. This was the ultimate gamble, a wager placed against the mountain itself. As he lit the fuse, its sputtering flame was a tiny, defiant star in the oppressive blackness, a spark of human greed about to unleash an ancient slumbering power. The explosion was not just a sound, it was a physical concussion that slammed into Jed, throwing him back against the tunnel wall. A wave of immense pressure pulsed through the bedrock, shaking the very bones of the mountain. A blinding, instantaneous flash of white light bleached the darkness for a fraction of a second, followed by a deafening, echoing roar that seemed to tear through the fabric of the world. Then, an absolute silence descended, made more profound by the ringing in his ears. The air became a thick, unbreathable cloud of pulverized rock and acrid smoke. Jed lay on the tunnel floor, disoriented, his lamp extinguished, plunged into a perfect, sensory-deprived void. For a long moment, the only thing that existed was the frantic, panicked hammering of his own heart against his ribs, a lone drumbeat in a newly silent universe. Slowly, painstakingly, Jed fumbled with his lamp, his trembling hands finally coaxing a weak, flickering flame back to life. As the acrid dust began to settle, he raised the light. Where the strange rock wall had been, there was now a hole, but it was not the jagged, shattered crater he expected from a dynamite blast. Instead, it was a nearly perfect circle, about 5 feet in diameter, its edges unnaturally smooth, as if they had been melted or bored by some impossible machine. The opening led not into a cavern of shattered rock, but into a tunnel that seemed to absorb the light from his lamp, revealing nothing of its depth. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air drifted out, carrying with it a scent he had never encountered in the mine. It was a vaguely sweet and fleshy aroma, like meat that had been slowly cooked over a low, smoky fire. Jed stood at the threshold, the carbide lamp held high, its light a feeble challenge to the profound darkness within the newly revealed passage. The tunnel did not look man-made. It had an organic quality, the smooth, dark walls seeming to curve inward just beyond the reach of the light, like the gullet of some titanic creature. The strange, sweet smell grew stronger, an unsettling mix of the savory and the corrupt that pricked at the base of his instincts, screaming at him to turn back. Fear, cold and primal, finally began to pierce through the armor of his greed. This was not a silver lode. This was something else, something ancient and wrong. Yet, the thought of returning empty-handed, of facing Mary's disappointed eyes and the gnawing hunger of his children, was a more immediate and tangible horror. He had come this far. He had wagered everything. He took a single, shuddering breath, the foul air filling his lungs. He had a family to feed. With a final, desperate surge of will, Jedediah Stone hardened his heart against the primal fear that screamed from the abyss. He tightened his grip on his pickaxe, adjusted the flame of his lamp to its brightest setting, and took the first step across the threshold. His heavy boot crunched on the floor of the new tunnel. He took another step. The darkness within was so absolute that it seemed to have a physical weight, pressing in from all sides, swallowing the light and sound. The glow from his lamp, which had illuminated 100 feet of mine tunnel just moments before, now barely reached 10 feet in front of him. After his third step, the faint sound of his boots on the unseen floor abruptly ceased. From the main gallery, it was as if he had simply vanished into the blackness. He never came out. The next morning, when Jedediah Stone failed to answer the roll call for the day shift, a cursory search was organized. Silas, his brow furrowed with concern, directed the men, but the company owners, wary of any disruption that could affect production quotas, urged a swift and simple conclusion. It was then that a small, almost insignificant pile of freshly fallen rock was discovered in Gallery 4B, a section of the mine miles away from the condemned Western Gallery. It was a minor cave-in, the kind that happened weekly, a collection of rocks barely large enough to trip a man, let alone bury him. It was a patently absurd explanation for a man's complete disappearance. Yet, for the mine's proprietors, it was not an explanation. It was an opportunity. It was a convenient, tidy, and, most importantly, financially sound conclusion to an inconvenient problem. The official report was written and filed before noon. Jedediah Stone. It read in cold, bureaucratic script, presumed deceased following a minor geological event in Gallery 4B. Body unrecoverable. The mine owners expressed their token regrets and started a small collection for the new widow. It was the cost of doing business. For the community, it was another sad but unremarkable tragedy in a long line of them. The men whispered their condolences. The women brought casseroles to Mary Stone's cabin, and then the relentless rhythm of the mine resumed. The incident was closed. But while the books were balanced and the story was set, a far more terrible accounting was about to begin. The convenient lie had sealed a man's fate on paper, but the truth of what Jedediah Stone had done, the door he had unlocked, was now a gaping wound deep in the heart of the mountain. For Silas Croft, the official explanation of Jedediah Stone's death was an insult to his intelligence and a profanation of a miner's passing. He stood before the so-called cave-in in Gallery 4BO, a place of bright, solid rock far from the mine's treacherous frontiers. The pile of rubble at his feet was pathetic, a child's stack of stones that wouldn't have bruised a man, let alone buried him. He kicked at a loose rock, his jaw tight with a cold fury. The dust that rose was old, settled. The rocks themselves showed signs of having been in that same spot for years. This wasn't a fresh collapse. It was a stage, poorly dressed and hastily presented. He could feel the lie in the still, undisturbed air of the tunnel. The company hadn't just covered up a death. They had desecrated the very concept of one, replacing a man's final, terrifying moments with a cheap, theatrical falsehood for the sake of uninterrupted profits. The next day, Silas presented his observations to the mine superintendent, a portly, sweat-prone man named Alistair Caldwell, whose concern for the mine extended only to its balance sheet. In his polished office, far from the grit and the gloom, Caldwell listened with a placid, dismissive air as Silas detailed the inconsistencies. "Silas, my good man," he began, his voice smooth as oil on water. "I appreciate your diligence. Truly. But what you're suggesting is unsettling. And unsettling things are bad for morale, and bad morale is bad for production." He leaned forward, the smile never leaving his face. "Jedediah Stone was a known risk-taker. The report is filed. The widow is compensated. The matter is concluded. It would be a shame for a foreman of your experience to find his position jeopardized by chasing shadows, wouldn't it?" The threat was unspoken but hung in the air, thick and suffocating as coal dust. Silas was being told to bury the truth alongside the man. In the week that followed, an uneasy quiet settled over the mining operation. Jed's name was mentioned in hushed whispers, his official death accepted on the surface but doubted in the gut. The miners, a superstitious lot by trade, felt a subtle shift in the mine's atmosphere. It was in this period that the first inexplicable reports began to surface. Experienced men, working deep seams they had known for months, started complaining of strange, unpredictable drafts in tunnels that were supposed to be dead ends. More unnervingly, the smell began to manifest, a faint, vaguely sweet and fleshy aroma, which would drift on these phantom currents before vanishing. Men would stop, sniff the air, and dismiss it as a pack rat dying in a fissure or some peculiar mineral deposit. But the scent was unlike anything they knew, and its intermittent, ghostly presence began to weave itself into the fabric of their growing anxiety. The fragile illusion of normalcy was shattered precisely 9 days after Jed's disappearance. A young miner, Thomas Riley, vanished. He was barely 20, eager to a fault, known for working hard to send money back to his family in the East. His last known location was a newly opened spur line on the 650-foot level, alarmingly close to the periphery of the condemned Western Gallery. One moment, his lamp was a steady point of light in the distance for his partner working down the corridor. The next, it was gone. His partner called out, heard nothing but the echo of his own voice, and went to investigate. He found only Riley's pickaxe, lying on the ground next to a half-filled ore cart. There was no cave-in, no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away. Thomas Riley had simply been erased from existence in the space between one swing of a pick and the next. The mountain had taken another. If Jed's death had been a whisper of trouble, Riley's vanishing was a scream. The company could not conjure a second convenient cave-in. The news spread through the camp not like a rumor, but like a contagion, infecting the men with a palpable fear. Work slowed to a crawl. The miners' folklore, once a collection of quaint tales to pass the time, was now consulted as a grim field guide to a new and hostile reality. The stories of Tommyknockers, the ghostly goblins said to knock on tunnel walls to warn of collapses, took on a sinister new meaning. What if the knocking wasn't a warning, but a signal? Men began to refuse to work alone, traveling in pairs or trios, their eyes constantly scanning the oppressive darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. Every strange sound, every flicker of a shadow, was now interpreted as a sign of imminent, unseen danger. The mine was no longer a workplace. It had become a hunting ground. For Silas Croft, the news of Tom Riley's disappearance was not a surprise, but a sickening confirmation of his deepest fears. The boy had been under his charge, and the foreman felt the loss with a paternal anguish that bordered on guilt. This was no longer a matter of a single, suspicious death. It was a pattern, a deliberate and predatory sequence of events. The company's lies and the miners' fear were a fog obscuring a terrible truth, and Silas knew he was the only one with the will to navigate it. His resolve hardened into something adamantine. He would find the answers that Alistair Caldwell was so desperate to keep buried. His investigation would not be about proving the company wrong, but about honoring the men he had lost. His quest began with a single, overriding question. What was so terrible about the Western Gallery that it had been sealed off in memory hold for decades? His search for answers led him away from the tunnels and into the one place the company overlooked, its own history. The archives were a small, windowless room behind Caldwell's opulent office, a forgotten repository of the mine's soul. The air was a dry, suffocating shroud of dust and brittle, decaying paper. Rolled maps were crammed into leaking barrels, and leather-bound ledgers sagged on warped shelves, their spines broken. This was the boneyard of past ambitions and forgotten failures. Silas lit a lantern, its glow illuminating swirling motes of dust, and began his painstaking excavation. He ignored the neatly filed documents of the current operation, instead digging into the older, more chaotic strata of the mine's past, looking for records from the claim's original owners, the men who had first faced the mountain's secrets. After hours of sifting through crumbling geological surveys and faded payrolls, he found it. It was a thick, moisture-stained ledger from the Orion mining concern, dated 1858. He traced the entries with a calloused finger, following the initial, optimistic reports about the excavation of a new Western Gallery on the 700-foot level. The foreman's script was neat and full of hope, detailing promising silver assays. Then, the tone began to change. Entries became shorter, more erratic. Bad air in 7 to West, one read. Men complain of headaches, seeing things. A week later, 2 men refuse to work the gallery, swear they hear voices whispering from the rock. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was dated October 12, 1858. It said simply, "Logan vanished, air foul, morale broken, ceiling gallery 7 West. God have mercy on our souls." Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Jed was not the first. Convinced he was on the right path, Silas dug deeper, finally unearthing a heavy wooden chest bound with rusted iron straps. Prying it open, he found a collection of antiquated surveying tools and, at the very bottom, a roll of waxed canvas. He carefully unfurled it on a dusty table. It was not a mining map. The insignia in the corner was one he recognized from his time in the Army. The UIS, Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. The map was dated 1849, a full decade before the Orion claim and long before the silver boom had turned these mountains into a hive of industry. It was a beautifully detailed rendering of the region's natural state, a ghost of the landscape as it once was. The cartographers, with painstaking precision, had documented the mountain's surface, its ridges, its valleys, and, most importantly, the locations of its natural caves and fissures. His eyes traced the intricate contour lines, comparing the Army's survey to his own mental map of the mine's layout, and then he found it. A distinct marking indicating a significant cave system, its entrance located at an elevation that corresponded precisely with the mine's 700-foot level. The location was a perfect match for the condemned Western Gallery. It was clear the original miners hadn't dug a new tunnel. They had broken into a pre-existing natural cavern. But what seized Silas's full attention was the crude, angry annotation made over the cartographer's pristine work. The entire area of the cave system had been aggressively crossed out with faded red ink, as if someone had tried to physically erase it from history. Next to this violent redaction, written in a spidery, trembling script, were 3 Latin words: Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons. The phrase was a classic cartographic warning for unexplored territory, a placeholder for the unknown. But this felt different. It was not a formal notation. It was a desperate scrawl, a personal warning left by someone who had seen what lay in the unknown lands. And beneath the Latin, another, more chilling phrase was written, this time in plain, stark English: peril to the soul. Silas stared at the words, his blood running cold. This was not a warning of rockfalls or poisonous gas. It was not a caution about hostile natives or dangerous beasts. It was a spiritual injunction, a declaration that venturing into that place meant risking not just one's life, but one's very essence. The map had ceased to be a geographical document. It was now a sacred text, a testament to a horror so profound it could only be described in terms of damnation. The miners hadn't sealed a dangerous tunnel. They had sealed an entrance to hell. As Silas stood transfixed by the accursed map, a new horror was unfolding in the depths of the mine. A seasoned mule skinner, leading his animal through a deep, isolated spur line, found his path blocked. His lead mule, Bess, had vanished from the train. After a frantic search, he found her in a small, unused side tunnel. The animal was dead, but not from any natural cause or accident. The scene was one of disciplined, systematic butchery. The mule's hindquarters and large sections of its torso had been expertly carved away, the cuts clean and precise, leaving behind a surgically violated carcass. The head, neck, and forelegs were completely untouched, left as if in display. No mountain lion or bear hunted with such cold, anatomical precision. This was the work of a butcher, one who operated in the absolute darkness of the mine with terrifying skill. The most disturbing element was not the visual horror of the scene, but the olfactory one. The air in the small tunnel was thick, almost syrupy, with the same nauseatingly sweet smell that had been haunting the miners for weeks. It was the scent of cooked meat, rich and savory, yet utterly profane in this context. The smell clung to the rock walls, seeped into the very ground, a persistent and undeniable signature of the unseen perpetrators. When other miners arrived, drawn by the Skinners' panicked shouts, they were stopped in their tracks by the aroma before they even saw the carcass. The scent triggered a primal, cognitive dissonance in their minds, the comforting smell of a campfire feast juxtaposed with a scene of inexplicable carnage. It was a sensory violation that hinted at a horror beyond their comprehension. The hunters were also cooking their prey. The day following the discovery of the butchered mule, the psychological warfare escalated. The unseen presence in the mine shifted from stealthy hunting to overt, terrifying displays. Tools began to move. A heavy, double-jack sledgehammer, last used by a team on the 400-foot level, was found standing perfectly upright in the exact center of a major intersection on the 600-foot level. A silent, monolithic warning. A miner's lunch pail, left on a ledge, was found empty an hour later, its contents gone, replaced by a handful of smooth, black river stones that could not possibly have come from inside the mine. These were not random acts. They were calculated messages, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of the mine's layout and the miners' habits. It was a clear declaration. We are here. We are watching you. This is our home, not yours. The paranoia reached a fever pitch. The culmination of this campaign of terror arrived in Silas's hands, delivered by a young miner so pale and shaken he could barely speak. The man had found it on the floor near the rotting barricade of the western gallery, the very place Jed had breached. It was a 6-inch length of bone, polished smooth by countless hands, its surface covered with strange, unnerving carvings. The patterns were geometric and complex, unlike any Paiute or European craftsmanship Silas had ever seen. One end was sharpened to a wicked point. Silas turned the object over in his palm, his blood freezing as he recognized its form. The slight curvature, the telltale shape of the ball joint at the top. It was a human femur, a piece of a man's thigh bone, fashioned into a tool or a weapon. The artifact was not just a message, it was a confession. The hunters of the deep were not animals. They were men, and they were cannibals. The fleeting glimpses of pale shapes in the darkness, the clicking and whistling sounds echoing from unexplored tunnels, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. The Gloom Folk, as the terrified miners had begun to call them in hushed whispers, were growing bolder. Their raids were becoming more brazen. They were no longer content to pick off the isolated and unwary. They were now actively probing the miners' defenses, testing their reactions, learning their schedules. The darkness was their ally, the labyrinthine tunnels their domain. They could move through secret passages and hidden fissures, emerging from the rock itself to strike and vanish without a trace. The miners were no longer pioneers taming a wild frontier. They were foreign invaders, vastly outnumbered and outmaneuvered in an enemy's territory, their lanterns providing not safety, but merely a target. Silas Croft stood in his small office, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. In one hand, he held the desecrated human bone. On the table before him lay the U.S. Army map, its red-inked warning a stark testament to a long-held secret. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, forming an image of unspeakable horror. Jed had not simply opened a tunnel. He had broken the seal on a tomb, unleashing a forgotten subterranean civilization that viewed the surface dwellers as an unexpected and bountiful harvest. The company would never act. Caldwell would sooner bury 100 men than admit a truth that could destroy the region's economy. The law would dismiss him as a madman. Silas looked from the bone to the map. His duty was clear. He was not just a foreman anymore. He was the last line of defense. He did not go to the sheriff or the superintendent. He went to the men who had bled with him, the grizzled veterans who had seen too much to believe in convenient lies. He gathered 5 of them in the quiet of the tool shed, away from fearful ears. There was old Mac, who could read the groans of the rock like a book, the 2 Irish brothers, Finn and Connor, who fought like devils and were fiercely loyal, and young Daniel, quiet and steady, the best marksman in the camp. Silas laid the map on a crate. He placed the sharpened femur beside it. He told them everything he knew, everything he suspected. He spoke of Jed and Riley, of the butchered mule, and of the Latin warning. He did not offer them bonuses or glory. He offered them only the terrible truth and a chance to face it, a chance to rescue the living, honor the dead, and confront the dragons in the dark. The investigation was over. The hunt was about to begin. Armed with the heavy, prophetic U.S. Army map and their own grim resolve, Silas Croft and his small company of 5 descended into the familiar darkness. Yet the mine felt different now. The air was charged with a palpable sense of trespass. Their weapons, a collection of Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers, felt like primitive talismans against a horror they could only guess at. Mac, his face a granite mask of concentration, took the lead, his senses attuned to the mine's subtle language, while the Irish brothers, Finn and Connor, flanked them, their nervous energy a stark contrast to young Daniel's cold focus. Silas brought up the rear, the map in one hand and a lantern in the other, its light a fragile bubble against an ocean of shadow. They were not merely miners anymore. They were exorcists, marching towards a malevolence that had slumbered for ages, ready to confront the dragons in their lair. They reached the rotted barricade of the western gallery and passed through the opening Jed had made, stepping into a corridor that had been sealed for a generation. The silence here was different. It was a dead, ancient stillness, undisturbed by the mine's lifeblood of air and water. The tunnel led them directly to the blast site, the wound Jed had torn in the fabric of their world. The hole was a perfect, smooth-edged circle, an unnatural geometry that defied the explosive chaos of dynamite. From its black maw, the scent that had haunted the upper levels now billowed out in a nearly solid wave. It was the rich, cloying smell of roasted meat, so thick they could taste it on their tongues. It was a smell of hearth and home, of feasts and celebration, and its presence in this cold, dead place was the most profound violation of all. For a long moment, no one moved, their courage wavering at this olfactory gateway to hell. Silas, steeling himself against the wave of revulsion, was the first to enter the new passage. The others followed, their boots making no sound on the strangely soft, damp floor. The tunnel was not like a mine shaft. It was a gullet, sloping ever downward into the planet's core. The walls were dark and polished, devoid of any tool marks. Curving organically as if formed by the passage of some immense serpent, the air grew warmer, humid, and thick with the profane aroma of cooking. The beam from Silas's lantern was swallowed by the darkness, revealing only a few feet of the passage ahead. They were blind, relying solely on the faded lines of the 1849 map. Every step felt like a deeper commitment to a fate they could not comprehend, a descent into a world that operated on rules utterly alien to the sunlit world above. They were no longer in a mine. They were inside something. After what felt like an eternity of descent, the tight passage abruptly opened into a space of impossible scale. The air before them shimmered with a faint, ghostly luminescence. Mac gasped, pointing his rifle upward. The cavern's ceiling, arching hundreds of feet above them, was coated in a living carpet of phosphorescent fungi. Vast constellations of pale blue and sickly green light pulsed gently, casting the entire subterranean vista in an ethereal, underwater glow. It was a place of grotesque beauty, a cathedral of decay. Pillars of rock, sculpted by millennia of dripping water, rose from the floor like the bones of forgotten gods. The sheer, breathtaking size of the cavern dwarfed them, reducing them to insignificant specks in a lightless, hidden world. This was not a cave. It was a country, a kingdom hidden beneath the floor of their own reality, forgotten by time and sun. As their eyes struggled to adjust to the dim, fungal light, the true nature of the cavern revealed itself. This was no natural wonder. It was a city. Sprawling before them was a metropolis of the damned. Crude, hive-like structures made of mud, rock, and bone clung to the cavern walls and rose in chaotic spires from the ground. Walkways carved from the rock connected towering edifices, and dark gaping maws served as doorways and windows. The architecture was nightmarish, a fusion of insectoid and human design, born from a culture that had known nothing but darkness and desperation. The scale of it was staggering, suggesting a population far larger than they could have imagined. This was the source of the legends, the truth behind the whispers. A civilization had festered here in the dark, evolving in secret, a cancer in the heart of the mountain. A sound, faint at first, drifted towards them on the warm, humid air. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, punctuated by a series of wet, guttural clicks and high-pitched whistles. It was the murmur of a populace, the sound of a society going about its business. Yet it was devoid of any human cadence. It was the language of the deep, the tongue of things that had lived too long in the dark. The sound drew them forward, as if by a physical cord, pulling them from the relative safety of the tunnel mouth and deeper into the ghastly city. They moved with ghost-like stealth, darting between massive rock pillars, their rifles held at the ready. The chanting grew louder, leading them toward a large open plaza in the city's center, which was more brightly illuminated by a denser cluster of the glowing fungi. Hiding behind a large, altar-like rock, they peered into the plaza. The sight that greeted them shattered their last vestiges of hope. Along one side of the open space stood a line of cages. They were not made of metal, but of sharpened stakes of wood and the unmistakable, ghastly white of bone. Human rib cages formed the bars, skulls the decorative finials, all lashed together with thick lengths of dried sinew and leather. Inside these horrifying enclosures were the missing miners. They saw Tom Riley, his youthful face a mask of catatonic terror, and half a dozen others, gaunt and trembling. They were livestock, a larder of human cattle waiting for the slaughter. The truth was stark and undeniable. The men weren't just being killed, they were being kept. They were being harvested. The focus of the plaza and of the chanting was a large, flat-topped boulder stained black with old blood. Gathered around this sacrificial altar were the city's inhabitants, the gloom folk. They were humanoid, but horribly warped by their sunless existence. Their skin was the pale, almost translucent white of a grub, their bodies wiry and emaciated, yet coiled with a predatory strength. Most were blind, their eyes milky, useless orbs, while a few possessed huge, black, liquid eyes that reflected no light, like those of a deep-sea fish. And on the altar, illuminated by the cold fungal glow, lay the fresh corpse of a miner. With practiced, ritualistic precision, Several of the gloom folk were butchering him with knives of sharpened bone and obsidian, their clicks and whistles growing more excited as they worked. The source of the sweet smell, the cause of the disappearances, was laid bare in a scene of absolute, profane horror. This was not a frenzied act of starvation. It was a sacrament, a towering creature, its pale skin a roadmap of scars, presided over the dismemberment, its guttural clicks forming a kind of unholy liturgy. As portions of the minor were carved away, they were placed on a ring of smaller, heated stones that surrounded the main altar, where they sizzled and cooked, releasing the rich, sweet aroma that had first lured Jedediah to his doom. This was their culture, their religion, their means of survival, all fused into one grotesque, cannibalistic ritual. They were not monsters in their own eyes. They were simply living as their ancestors had been forced to live for centuries. For Silas and his men, the sight was a psychic blow, a confirmation of a truth so vile it threatened to shatter their sanity. They were witnessing the functioning, everyday reality of a society built on the consumption of their own kind. Suddenly, a choked sob escaped from young Daniel's throat. That's Arthur," he whispered, recognizing the man on the altar. The small sound cut through the ritualistic drone like a gunshot. In perfect, terrifying unison, every head in the plaza swiveled towards their hiding place. The sightless, milky eyes and the huge black orbs all fixed on their position with an unnerving accuracy, as if they could see by sound alone. The scarred leader threw its head back and unleashed a piercing, chittering shriek that echoed off the cavern walls, a signal, an alarm. The plaza, a moment before filled with dozens of creatures, emptied in an instant. The gloom folk did not flee. They vanished, melting into the dark doorways and unseen crevices of their city with a silent, terrifying speed. The trap was sprung. The attack was a symphony of silent, coordinated violence. A pale form dropped from a ledge above, landing silently behind Connor and driving a bone spear into his shoulder. From a dozen dark openings, the gloom folk poured forth, not in a wave, but as individual predators converging on their prey. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their pale bodies a blur in the dim light, their bare feet making no sound on the rock floor. The cavern erupted with the deafening roar of Winchester rifles as Finn and Silas opened fire, the muzzle flashes illuminating fleeting images of contorted, snarling faces. Creatures fell, their thin blood dark in the fungal glow, but their numbers seemed endless. For every one they shot, two more emerged from the shadows, their movements guided by a perfect, innate understanding of the three-dimensional battlefield. In the desperate, chaotic maelstrom of combat, Silas finally understood. The legends of the Paiute were true, a band of their ancestors, trapped by a great earthquake or cataclysm centuries ago, had not died. They had endured. Stripped of sunlight, of plants, of animals, they had turned to the only available source of sustenance, each other. Ritual cannibalism became survival, which in turn became culture. Their sightless eyes, their pale skin, their clicking language, all were adaptations to an eternity of absolute darkness. They were not demons, they were the ultimate survivors, the horrifying product of evolution in a sealed and godless world. We, the surface dwellers, with our blind greed for silver, were not conquerors. We were a sudden, unexpected bounty, a delivery of fresh meat to a starving, lightless kingdom. "They're in the walls," Max screamed, his voice strained as he clubbed a creature with the butt of his empty rifle. "They're using tunnels we can't see." He was right. The gloom folk were using a network of hidden passages within the very structure of their city, striking and then retreating into the rock itself to emerge from another angle. It was a battle they could not win. A spear thrown from a dark ledge caught Finn in the thigh, and he went down with a cry of pain. Before Daniel could reach him, two creatures darted from a fissure at his feet, seizing him by the arms and dragging him, screaming, into the darkness of the rock. "Back!" Silas roared, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. "Back to the passage. Dynamite. We have to seal it." The mission had failed. Rescue was impossible. The only thing left was containment. Mac, his face set with a terrible and final resolve, turned to face the swarming creatures. "Go, I'll buy you time," he shouted, swinging his rifle like a club into the oncoming tide. Silas grabbed the wounded, weeping Connor, and with Daniel providing covering fire, they began the desperate scramble back towards the tunnel mouth. The last thing they saw was Mac, the old steady miner, being overwhelmed by a wave of pale, grasping hands. They fled up the sloping passage, the clicks and whistles of the gloom folk echoing just behind them, a promise of relentless pursuit. They had found the truth. They had looked into the abyss and seen the faces of the dragons. The cost of that knowledge was the lives of their friends, their images now burned into their minds, a permanent, haunting monument to the horror that waits, patiently and hungrily, beneath our feet. They stumbled back through the organic tunnel, a desperate two-man retreat from a world of living nightmare. Silas half-dragged, half-carried Connor, whose sobbing gasps were the only human sounds in the passage. Behind them, the pursuit was not a thunderous charge, but something far more terrifying. A chorus of sharp, eager clicks and whistling calls that seemed to echo from the very rock around them. A sound of intelligent predators coordinating a hunt in their native terrain. The air was still thick with the scent of cooked human flesh, a smell that now coated their throats and clung to their souls. When they finally burst through the circular opening back into the familiar dust and geometry of the mine, the contrast was a physical shock. They were back in their world, but they had brought the psychic contamination of the other with them, their minds forever scarred by the sight of the fungal city and its ravenous, waiting populace. There was no time for grief or hesitation. Silas Croft's face was a mask of cold, adamantine resolve, his actions driven by a duty that had superseded all other human emotion. The horror he had witnessed could not be allowed to reach the surface. It was a plague that had to be cauterized. With a grim economy of motion, he took the last of their dynamite, the very same agent of greed that Jedediah had used to open this wound, and repurposed it as a tool of quarantine. He packed the explosives deep into the bedrock around the horrifying, smooth-edged portal. As he worked, Connor, his eyes wide with a terror that had burned past sanity, could only watch. Silas lit the long fuse, its sizzle a frantic countdown against an eternity of darkness. He took one last look into the maw, a final glance into a living hell, before turning and pulling Connor into the relative safety of the main gallery. The detonation was a cataclysmic, earth-shattering event, far more powerful than Jed's initial blast. The mountain screamed. A colossal wave of pressure tore through the galleries, extinguishing their lanterns and plunging them into absolute, ringing blackness. The sound was not a bang, but a deep, grinding roar of planetary bones breaking and resetting. They felt the floor heave beneath their feet as tons of ancient rock, loosened by the blast, collapsed inward, bearing the passage to the subterranean city under an impenetrable mountain of rubble. The very air was sucked from their lungs before rushing back in a thick, choking cloud of pulverized stone. When silence finally returned, it was a heavy, tomb-like stillness. In that moment, Silas and Connor were not survivors. They were gatekeepers who had just sealed their friends, both living and dead, into a mass grave with their devourers. News of the disaster reached the surface as a garbled, panicked report of a second, larger explosion deep within the mine. For Alistair Caldwell, the mine superintendent, the event was not a tragedy, but a narrative godsend. It was the perfect, all-encompassing lie he needed. Within hours, the official story was crafted and disseminated with ruthless efficiency. A massive, naturally occurring fire damp explosion, a known and respected mining hazard, had ripped through the deeper levels. The initial, smaller blast, Jed's, had weakened the geological structures, leading to the catastrophic second event that had claimed the lives of over a dozen men, including the brave foreman Silas Croft's exploratory party. The mine was declared structurally unsound, a death trap. The company's official report, filed with the county clerk, was a masterpiece of corporate fiction, citing unforeseeable geological pressures and concluding that the mine must be permanently sealed to prevent any further loss of life. Silas and Connor emerged from the dust and chaos not as men returning from a battle against monsters, but as the sole, lucky survivors of a tragic industrial accident. They were hailed as heroes, their story of a sudden, fiery blast recited for them by company men until it almost felt real. But the lie was a prison. They were pariahs of their own experience, unable to speak the unspeakable truth. How could they explain a city of blind cannibals to a world that believed only in silver and God? Connor descended into a bottle, his nights filled with alcohol-fueled screaming, his waking hours spent staring into nothingness, forever haunted by the clicking sounds. Silas, a man hollowed out by his own grim duty, collected his pay and simply vanished, leaving town one night without a word, unable to look at the mountain that housed the tomb he had been forced to create. Their silence was the final seal on the truth. The mine, now a place of mass death in the public consciousness, was rechristened, no longer just a claim number or a prospector's hopeful title. It earned a name that encapsulated the official tragedy and the profound sense of loss that gripped the community. The Misery Lode. The name stuck, becoming a permanent fixture on local maps and in the local lexicon. The sealing of the entrance was a public affair, a somber ceremony of closure. Under the watchful eyes of company officials and grieving families, stonemasons erected a thick brick wall, a final, definitive barrier. The heavy iron door was bolted shut, a theatrical display of ensuring no one would ever again wander into the supposedly unstable depths. For the public, it was an act of safety and remembrance. For the handful who knew the truth, it was a desperate and perhaps temporary act of quarantine against a waiting, hungry world. Over the ensuing decades, as the eyewitnesses died or disappeared, the stark, official story of the fire damp explosion began to fray. The truth, too monstrous to be remembered, did not vanish but instead metastasized into folklore. The story of the Misery Lode became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to greenhorn miners. The dozen men weren't killed by an explosion, the legend claimed. They were taken. The mountain itself had developed a hunger, or vengeful Paiute spirits, angry at the desecration of their land, were dragging men into the earth. The faint, fragmented accounts of clicking sounds and pale, fleeting shapes became the basis for stories about monstrous Tommyknockers. The cannibalistic core of the horror was too awful to be passed down, so it was sublimated into something more supernatural and less nauseatingly real, a chilling campfire tale about a haunted mine that swallowed souls. Today, the entrance to the Misery Lode stands as a quiet, melancholy monument on the scarred face of the mountain. The brickwork is crumbling, the iron door a solid sheet of rust. The sagebrush has reclaimed the dusty grounds where a bustling camp once stood. It has become a dark tourist spot, a destination for amateur historians and ghost hunters armed with EMF meters and a thirst for a paranormal thrill. They tell the legend of the fire damp explosion and the spirits of the dead miners who are said to haunt the tunnels beyond the wall. In a display of poignant, terrible irony, visitors often leave small offerings at the base of the sealed door: faded plastic flowers, small painted rocks, trinkets of remembrance for the men who died in the accident. They stand there, paying tribute at the gates of a forgotten kingdom, unaware that their quiet sympathies are offered at the very barrier that holds back a civilization that may still hunger. This raises a question that lingers in the dusty Nevada air, a question as deep and unsettling as the mine itself. In the final, grim accounting of this tragedy, who, precisely, were the monsters? Were they the gloom folk, a lost tribe warped by centuries of darkness and starvation into doing what was necessary to endure? Their entire culture a testament to a desperate will to live? Or were we the monsters, the surface dwellers, driven by a different kind of hunger, a blind, rapacious greed for a shiny, lifeless metal? We, who clawed our way into the bowels of a world that was not ours, deaf to the warnings and indifferent to the balance we were shattering, only to be confronted by a horror our own avarice had awakened. The answer, perhaps, lies in the darkness, sealed behind a wall of brick and iron, waiting to be forgotten. The final image is a slow, deliberate push-in on the rusted iron door of the Misery Lode. The bolts remain, hammered shut a century and a half ago, a final, desperate statement. As the camera gets closer, we see the texture of the decay, the way the wind has etched patterns into the rust, a silent testament to the passage of time. There is no sound but this wind, a lonely, mournful whisper that seems to carry a faint, clicking echo from deep within the earth. The implication is chillingly clear. The seal is old, and the hunger it contains is patient and eternal. To ensure that the darkest chapters of our history are never forgotten, and that the archives of these grim events are preserved against the decay of time, subscribe and help us keep the shadows alive.